Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Daily French Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Mr. Marius Roodt, who is having to broadcast to us today from a sort of shared space because his power is out due to load shedding. Marius, how are you doing?
Right from you, Nick.
I'm not too bad. And we also have Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. Wet and quite chilly Cape Town. The winter seems to be hanging on here. But pleased to say no load shedding at the moment, although I think it is due to start at 2. So I'll be joining you shortly, Morris. Yeah.
I'm currently being load shed, which is why my face is illuminated like a ghost out of the darkness.
It's funny how we all get used to it, huh? I mean, we just take it in our stride these days.
I don't think I could be used to stage 6, to be honest. But
no,
this is my line in the sand. Anyway, yes. Speaking of load shedding, I think this is a great story. And this is the amount of solar panels imported by South Africans. South Africa has quadrupled its solar panel imports from China in the first half of 2023. We've had a massive increase in the imports of solar panels, 438% increase in imports. Sure. And in the last 12 months, South Africa has imported 4 gigawatts of solar panels just from China, where most of the solar panels are made. That generates electricity about the equivalent of 3% of the total national demand. And in the last 6 months, that's 3.4 gigawatts. And a lot of this is due to businesses or private households basically going off the grid, or at least adding to the grid with these sort of feed-in tariffs that both Johannesburg and Cape Town, I think, are now implementing. A lot of people in wealthier houses who can afford it are getting off the grid. Government is also offering a little bit of a tax rebate for businesses and households that do this. And I think that considering the level of poverty in this country and that there's not that many people who can afford to import solar panels, this is pretty good going. The fact that ordinary South Africans who have the means are making a plan, and that actually does help the rest of society too, because it takes more pressure off the grid. And it does make me ask the question, Michael, is it actually possible that ordinary South Africans and businesses are going to be able to sort of muddle our way out of this despite government's best efforts?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's funny, in our household, we've been having this debate, should we take the plunge and get the inverter and start thinking about investing in the solar panels and so on. We haven't got there yet, and so many people in our neighborhood have, and lots of our friends have. It is quite a big outlay, I think, if you're going to do it properly. And part of part of my sort of perhaps faintly naively optimistic view is that, perhaps we don't need to go in quite so deep just yet, because I'm sure that as these things change, as the private sector becomes more effectively involved, and obviously here also in the Western Cape, as the sensible politicians are focusing on alternative solutions to Eskom, that maybe, it won't necessarily be an urgent need in a year or two's time. But nevertheless, I think what people are doing, I do have a little, is it UPS, is it called, or USB? I forget which it is.
Yeah, uninterrupted power supply.
Only there we go, to feed to keep the router going. So that's this kind of minimum thing, and we have all the all the little lights and things we plug in and so on, and replaced all the bulbs. So this is symptomatic of the entire society adjusting to a crisis, not simply being knocked flat by it, beginning to make its own decisions. New choices, different choices, and the private sector has obviously come to the fore with offering all the products and offering all the versions of them and ways of doing things. Yeah, I mean Carly's quite right. There's a risk as we enter this new terrain. We've had our battery on the gate, the electric gate, changed 3 times, I think, in the past year and a bit. People who come to fix it say, well, this is what we're doing all the time these days. The batteries just can't cope with the load shedding. So there are difficulties. But as the story indicates, South Africa is not the kind of country that just gives up. and falls over. We are as a people accustomed to living at the edge of crisis and dealing with it and finding solutions quite quickly. Private sector, which is very light on its feet and has to be. Just a pity we have so much intervention and meddling with it, but nevertheless, yeah, I think this is a sign of exactly the thing that we think is so good about South Africa.
Of course, it's not a perfect solution. It is expensive.
Yeah, exactly.
And as has been pointed out in the comments, there are concerns, very serious concerns about the ethical nature of sourcing these things from places like China, where we know that, for example, in Xinjiang province, that people have been used in forced labor to make stuff like this, or in factories. And the fact that most of these solar panels come from China, I think, is not ideal, to say the least. And yet it still is, I think, for South Africans, probably one of the better options, in that it is something where people can make a plan. We actually we had a talk by a member of what's called the Mini Grids Association. And this is a guy who works in an African organization, which in these countries where you've got grids that have basically either never really been built or just fallen over due to decay and that kind of stuff, due to mismanagement, places like Nigeria, places like Tanzania, places like the DRC, that there's this emerging market in Africa of these guys who set up these solar panels, which can power like a street. It's like a mini power station. And the main opponent to them remains, in many cases, government regulation, which seeks to basically drive out competition for the state-controlled power company. It's not just South Africa that has that problem. Marius, what do you make of this whole issue of South Africans taking charge of our own power, going off the grid? What are your thoughts?
I mean, it's obviously good, but very few South Africans, I think, can afford it. A friend of mine installed solar at his house about 6 months ago. So cost him, I think, about 130,000 Rand. And he saved a bit because his brother is not a solar installer, but an engineer who's very handy. So he saved a lot on the labor and so on. So 130,000 Rand, that's simply, I mean, most people don't have that kind of money lying around. I mean, we work for an NGO, so that's about double our annual salaries. I mean, but jokes aside, I mean, most people can't afford that kind of money. And also, as somebody pointed out in the comments, you invest that money into your house. That's the extra 130,000 Rand you've put into your house. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get that money back. So in a lot of ways, it's lost money almost. But that said, I think a lot of people, when they buy houses now, might insist you're going to have solar or some kind of option to make your house sellable. And also, this is pretty bad for Eskom because more people that go off the grid, the less revenue Eskom gets, and Eskom is going to continue its death spiral, which is probably inevitable at this point. But yeah, it's, I think that's just going to hasten the end of Eskom, which we probably need actually, and we have to go and see. But yeah, it's South Africans do make a plan, as the saying goes, a boer maak 'n plan, and I think that's happening across the country. But as with many of these things, the people who can make a plan are people who have resources. Most people, including people who are full-time employed and so on, simply don't have that kind of money, and they just have to deal with load shedding or have other kinds of interventions, like UPSs or inverters and all that kind of thing. But we know also, I mean, as somebody said in the comments now, those things also don't last, and then you've got to fork out something. I don't even know how much a UPS is, 2,000-3,000 Rand or whatever. It's still quite a lot of money for a lot of people. So, at the end of the day, what you need is a proper power company who can supply reliable electricity without having to do all these kinds of things. But, that's if wishes were horses, I suppose.
Right.
But we don't have that. So people need to, deal with the country we have, not the one we want.
Exactly. I think we are in this situation where actually, and I would like to emphasize again the fact that when, wealthier people go off the grid, it causes problems for Eskom because it takes that money away, but at least lessens the impact on the grid, right? Because you have fewer houses needing the electricity, which is good then for people who can't afford the solar, because it means that, in theory at least, they might get less load shedding. But I think the real takeaway for me from this, Michael, is that, we talk about South African resilience, but it's always like a sort of painful conversation. It's like we're having to thrive in this really tough, awkward environment that's so painful. But I think the flip side of that is that what we've seen is that there's a lot of people willing to put time, effort, money, and and perseverance into South Africa. And that if we can get some of these policies right, if we see political policy change in this country, that we stand to benefit, I think, from that energy, from all of these people who all these years have built up this resilience, and that if the blocks are removed, people will really be able to fly. If we started taking apart Eskom, if we really opened up the market aggressively, if we lowered taxes, if we grew the economy, we could really see South Africans taking the opportunities that would give them and flying with them and getting us out of this mess much faster than I think many people think it would take. What do you make of that?
I think that's absolutely right. It's a point that Marius made as well, that what we really need is an effective state machinery. Our colleague on the Daily Friend, Andrew Kenny, often writes about the fact that diehard capitalist though he is, he thinks that power generation is one of those things that is best kept in the province of the state, because all it really requires is you get a generator running and you keep it running and you look after it properly, and you maintain things, and it's just really as simple as that. And the state can get cheaper finance than anyone else, so it makes absolute sense. But then that is, as Marius says, this is really the thing that we want. And as you said, Nicholas, it's an indication, with all this, as you say, the energy, the enterprise, the dynamism, and so on that exists in society. If we could clear the hurdles, get the right policies, get the right staffing, there's absolutely no reason why we can't return to that, or have not necessarily. I mean, Eskom was always very good, but we want a new kind of Eskom. We don't want to go back to anything. We're facing the front, and there's no reason why it can't work, and can't work effectively. Yeah.
Well said. Okay, speaking of,
I just want to make one point on that, talking about resilience and so on. There was a good article by Claire Bissiker of Business Day, I think, this week, and it was about the state of the economy and how resilient business are in South Africa. And her last paragraph, I think it's quite telling. It says, South Africans should avoid setting the bar so low that business survival is confused with resilience. Let's not kid ourselves. Fragility is a far more accurate description of the state of the economy. So So just to put a damper on.
No. I think it's very valid, and it reminds me actually of a visit that I made to Lebanon. Actually, my wife's family from Lebanon in 2019. Absolutely fascinating country and wonderful people. But they have power crises themselves. And several times during the day, the national power supply power utility shuts down, and there's a brief sort of moment wherever you are, whether in a restaurant or a fancy shop or just walking down the street, everything goes dark for a second or two, and then it all powers up again. And that's because there are all these private power companies that are there to fill in the gap. And if you talk to Beirutis particularly, they'll tell you that one of the problems is now that everybody's got so used to this pattern that the greatest resistance to fixing the national power utility is coming from the private power suppliers, because their business model now depends on their being there and being able to respond. So I mean, one must be careful of seeing these solutions as real long-term solutions. In that particular case, I think it's just a perpetuation of the crisis in a different form, and I think Marius is quite right. We want to try and avoid that.
All right. Speaking of bad governance, Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, was speaking at the Oil and Gas Conference in Cape Town. He was complaining about how several oil and gas exploration projects around the country, Total Energies project in the Western Cape, a project in the Free State, a coal project, have been blocked by litigation from environmental activist groups, NGOs. However, I think he went a bit, shall we say, a bit far. He said that NGOs had unlimited resources as a result of being funded by foreign entities, which enabled them to take the department to court. Quote, many of the non-governmental organizations that take us to court have unlimited resources. They are funded by foreign entities. When a non-governmental organization is funded by a Ford Foundation or by a number of those entities in the United States, you can't rule out the fact that some of it comes from the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and it's a deliberate program to block development in poor countries like South Africa. Now, I am pretty much in favor of developing our oil and gas reserves. I think it's an important sort of medium-term economic boost. Maybe we want to move away from those technologies eventually, but I think that in the short term, we desperately need that growth, or else we're really not going to be able to do anything. But this is crazy. Marius, what are your thoughts?
Oh dear.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing you can really say about it. And probably it's quite revealing of our attitude to, what's happening in Ukraine, where we seem to be, at least implicitly supporting Russia rather than the West. I mean, whatever you think about the war, it's pretty clear who our sympathies lie with, or at least the government sympathies. But I think this kind of conspiratorial thinking is probably quite common, at least within the ANC, and possibly amongst some people in the government. And it's pretty concerning. And as somebody made the point, the CIA is probably supportive of oil and gas companies making money, especially American-linked ones. So it wouldn't really make sense that they want to block this kind of thing. And I don't think the American government, I mean, we know the American government's done some pretty dodgy things in the past, and probably still, we know it's been behind coups and so on, especially in Latin America and that. So, I mean, obviously they're not angels, but I really don't think that they have a plan to keep South Africa at its less than 1% economic growth rate that we have at the moment. It makes more sense for the US to support countries where economic growth is happening, and that richer countries are more stable. I mean, it's a fact. Everybody knows this.
Right, it's straight out of the ZANU-PF playbook of blaming a foreign country. And of course, on the geopolitical strategy side here, the US currently wants there to be more producers of oil, particularly in the global market, because that pushes oil prices down, which is not just good for them, but hurts the Russian economy, which is their big enemy right now. Michael, there are good arguments that could be made here about why we should be doing gas and oil exploration. There was a piece in the Daily Friend today from Ivor Fector about big industry and that kind of stuff. But this is not really helping the case, is it?
Exactly. And, as you kind of implied in introducing the story, we all have a kind of sympathy, in a sense, with at least the Mantashe's frustrated sentiments about people blocking development, the very things we need. It's quite likely that if you in the ANC, you maybe view all that boodle slightly differently from the way that we liberals would do, but nevertheless, we kind of share his frustration that there are people blocking an opportunity for South Africa to really do amazing things. But the way to overcome this is actually to make good, solid arguments, not to come up with these silly ideas. There might indeed be an element of truth in the fact that, if the Ford Foundation or whoever it is, I don't know enough about these things, does have some arcane sort of connection to American intelligence. Maybe there's some kind of possibility of some sort of influence being brought to bear, but it's actually irrelevant. The main thing is there's probably fairly big public support for the green organizations who are opposing fracking and so on, and it's an argument that has to be won in public, and it's possible to do this. It's possible to make a case, and that's the only way to do it. You've just got to keep making that case. I think the fact that Amazon won its case here in the Western Cape, expensive though it was, to their credit, they kind of sort of hung in there, or perhaps they were already committed and they just had to. But I think certainly with energy sources, it's a hugely important argument to have, and to have it in public. And you mentioned Ivor's piece today. I recommend to viewers to have a look at it, because it really is very good, and it makes some very cogent points. But one of them is that this obsession with blocking big companies and being suspicious of sort of big oil or big pharma or big whatever it is that it's the big companies who have the much greater interest in dotting the I's and crossing the T's and sticking to environmental commitments and sticking to the law, not being unscrupulous, not trying to get away with things, because they are so visible. They're huge and they stick out like a sore thumb, and it's in their interest to make sure that their compliance is on track, that they've got good people employed to deal with communities and to see to the effects of what it is they're doing. Doesn't mean they don't make mistakes, or that they're just like any other human enterprise. There always going to be errors and failures and so on. But the fact is, it's likely that if you're dealing with these big exploration exercises, you're dealing with people who are serious about what they're doing. They're not simply there to make a fast buck out of something frivolous and unscrupulous. And this is really the kind of argument we need to make, and hold them to account. But don't just chase them away thinking that you're going to be better off, because it's very likely that you're not.
Right, and Montage is sort of complaining here. Like, if you're losing in court to these environmental groups, obviously there's a certain level to which just going to court can slow you down. But if you're losing, it's probably because either A, the department made a mistake, which you as the minister need to fix, or B, the government has implemented legislation which the court is using to judge these projects by. And if the legislation is bad, then the minister should change the legislation if it's too
exactly.
But we see instead the real roadblocks to actually developing this industry is that government is currently creating this gas and oil bill, which is supposed to regulate this stuff. And one of the things it basically says is the government gets 20% of the project, but doesn't have to put any money in, regardless of how much you invest or whether it makes a profit. And also 10% has to be given to BE shareholders, who I believe are not even able to sell their shares unless it's to another BE partner. That's a real impediment to growth. Not this, not this legislation stuff, which is, not this litigation stuff. Marius, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair and valid for the government to want some stake in this thing or in these projects and get something out of it. But obviously, then the money's got to be used properly. I mean, like I think somewhere like Norway is a good example, where it's used the profits from its oil industry into one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world, if not the biggest. And that money is plowed back into Norway. It's invested for the good of the country, and to build schools and health clinics and give the Norwegians opportunities. We've seen what happens in Africa and the oil-rich states, places like Angola and Nigeria and Gabon and Equatorial Guinea. All the money from the oil basically ends up in people at the top's pockets. The richest woman in the world until quite recently was Isabel dos Santos, who was the daughter of, not the richest woman in the world, rich woman in Africa at least, Isabel dos Santos, who was the daughter of the late Angolan president, José Eduardo dos Santos. So these things are all obviously a good idea, but they need to, or good idea in theory, but we need a government that's actually going to invest the money where it needs to go. And they also all said, just on the issue of the greenies, they also, I think, concerns about the environment are also valid. And we must also remember that this isn't only our planet. It also belongs to all the other creatures that live on this planet with us. And at the same, but we have to get the balance between development and protecting the environment, because it's easy to tell somebody who's living, in a shack in the Eastern Cape, and they're never going to have any kind of job, that we're not allowed development because we have to worry about the butterflies that live on the south coast or whatever the case is. But you have to get that balance between human development and protecting the environment. And I think it's a difficult thing, but I think it needs to be done.
I I do have an answer to that final point, but I'm going to save that for another time.
All the animals.
We don't have enough time in this show to really properly explore that one. Suffice to say that I do differ slightly from you on that last point. But anyway, let's move on to our last topic for today, and this is a bill being put forward by the Democratic Alliance, the DA, to amend the Constitution 19th Amendment Bill, which would limit motions of no confidence or in presidents or provincial premiers to once a year, unless for serious grounds of misconduct. Now, I think I'm not sure about, you'd have to see the wording there, because I'm sure that a loophole could creep in there. But anyway, the idea behind this is that the DA says that it wants to create more stable provincial and national governments. We do face the possibility next year of having, at the very least, a number of provinces run by complicated coalitions, and possibly even the national government being run by a complicated coalition. And if the metros have been anything to go by, that could mean an awful lot of motions of no confidence. Now, it's one thing when the city of Joburg changes mayors every 5 minutes, It's another thing when South Africa changes presidents every 5 minutes. You can imagine the President Steenhuisen, then a President Ramaphosa, then a President Malema, who knows? And round and round. It would not, shall we say, invite a lot of confidence, I think, in the country or its political stability. So that's the idea behind this. The DA said that the abuse of motions of no confidence would have a catastrophic results for any province, and most certainly with the economy and deep inequalities which any government in 2024 would need to concern itself with. There was some support for this legislation from the Freedom Front Plus, although in the debate being held, it seems like there weren't that many attendees to the parliamentary session. The EFF opposed this, saying that the bill is inherently anti-democratic and seeks to impose limits on the democratic rights to remove people from office. Now, the ANC has said that it doesn't really want to support this bill because it's got its own version of it and it doesn't want to support the DA's efforts. I can kind of see both sides of this. Obviously, in the chaos that's been sowed by all the spurious motions of no confidence in our municipalities is not great. But at the same time, when the legislature is out of whack with the executive, you can have very serious problems for your stability, particularly in our system. You can see a situation where a coalition changes halfway through the year, and then you've got 6 months for a president who doesn't have the support of the legislature trying to govern, which could be in some cases good, but in some cases also a mess. I don't know. Michael, what do you make of this?
I think I'm a bit like you. I mean, I recognize the risk, but I feel sure also that it should be possible to clarify exactly what the serious grounds of misconduct, for instance, would amount to, and to provide as much leeway as possible for parties to exercise this right under serious conditions. But at the same time, I think there is some merit in trying to set down the basis for building a more stable kind of coalition politics, and maybe this is where to go. I can't quite remember who it was. It might have been France, Cronier, and the Social Research Foundation, suggesting some time ago that other kinds of things that we could be looking at would be contracts between parties entering coalitions, and maybe that's an alternative. I don't know whether that's something that would need to be legislated necessarily, but I mean, one can see the sense of it. I think the EFF is being a bit disingenuous in speaking up for democracy. They're not. It's not a default position of theirs by any means. Certainly, one wants to be conscious of the potential risks, but I do think there's this merit in looking at steps to stabilize the politics of the next while that we're heading into.
Marius, your thoughts before we close the report today?
This isn't actually such a new idea. Ekurhuleni, where I live, in their municipal council, you can only do a motion of no confidence every 6 months, I think it is. So this isn't, like out of the blue. And Ekurhuleni is actually a place where the EFF is basically governing the place by itself. Maybe that's why, I don't know, very rarely have water these days at where I stay. But yeah, so I mean, this isn't such a new idea, and I think we probably do need some kind of guardrails to keep coalition stable. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the political parties involved, and I think we need a kind of political parties themselves have started becoming a bit more mature and putting South Africans first. I mean, we can see what's happening in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni actually, and Nelson Mandela Bay, where the ANC and EFF together voted to put in mayors from micro parties, basically parties that got less than 1% of the votes in the last municipal elections in those cities. And it's clear that there's no thought is given to the actual people who live in these places, and even the rhetoric from political parties. I remember after the 2021 election, people were talking about the EFF was saying, okay, what will happen, guys, is we'll give Action SA Johannesburg, the ANC can get Ekurhuleni, and we want Tshwane. Speaking as if the municipalities are these things to be given away amongst political parties and enjoy the benefits, instead of thinking, what's the best way we can run this place? and we have to run it in, with other political parties. What's going to be the best outcome for the people who live here? And political parties, most of them, I don't think they think like that. What is the best for the political party and for the people who are in this political party, not what's best for the people who actually live there. And I think that's a problem in South Africa. And there was a German politician, I can't remember who, but they said a good politician puts the country first, then their party, and then themselves. And I think the problem in South Africa is that a lot of politicians have it exactly the wrong way around. Put themselves first, then the party, and then the country, or the city, whatever the case is. But yeah, I think these things aren't a bad idea, but at the end of the day, we're only going to have stable coalition politics when political parties themselves grow up and mature, I think.
No, I think that's the key here, is that you can put in all the rules you like, but if everyone is intent on breaking the system, you're really not going to get anywhere, because people will find the loopholes wherever they may be. I mean, serious misconduct, every time there's a version of no confidence, regardless of how silly or spurious it is, there are accusations that the mayor or the president or whatever has done the most atrocious thing ever in human history, and that's why they need to be removed, regardless of how grounded in fact that actually is. Okay, so that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening. We hope that you enjoyed the show, and we will be back on Monday. Have a great weekend, everyone. Cheers.